We live in a time where masculinity is shamed and men don't know what it means to be a man. As a pastor and counselor, I've spent the better part of my life equipping and training others. My goal with this show is to translate my hard-earned experience into tools and tactics to help you become stronger as a man. This is the BraveCo podcast. I'm your host, Jason Vellet. Welcome back, men, to the BraveCo podcast. I'm excited to be back this week. I have an awesome guest this week. He's a friend that I'm just getting to know, a close friend of mine, Tim Papatic. Tim, just a little shout out for you. He doesn't get shouted out very often, so that'll be new to him. I'm kidding. But my guest this week, his name is David Johnson. He's such a cool man. We had lunch probably like 4 months ago, and I got to sit down with you in person and meet your family and hang out. But you've been in ministry for a long time. You're a pastor in Florida. You run a ministry called Project 2411, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you were also in law enforcement for, I think, 10 years is what you said, and then a part of the Secret Service. So, man, you've done a lot of stuff. I'm excited to have you on here. We're going to talk about some guy stuff today.
That sounds great. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, man. What got you into law enforcement?
You know, it's funny. I get this question a lot. The older I get, the more I get the question. I think is it was kind of an interesting dynamic. I wasn't planning to do it that way. I actually wanted to be a lawyer coming out of high school and college, and then in the midst of wanting to be a lawyer, I decided that I was going to be an FBI agent. And so when it's a long story.
Yeah. How do you make that transition?
You know, it's interesting. I had kind of both of them on my bucket list, and you could do both of them. A lot of lawyers are FBI agents, and a lot of FBI agents are lawyers. And at the time that I was looking to do that and enter into grad school, a number of things were going off in my family, and I was recently married, young in college, and looking to get into grad school, take the entry exam into law school. And they're like, "Hey, kid, we're not hiring." So like, okay, great. You just can't come join the FBI. You're going to have to go get some experience. And so here I am, a young, early 20s, young man, newly married, with a child on the way, thinking of going to law school. And I thought, well, I got to start paying my bills,
Yeah.
And so part of the experience conversation kicked in and said, "Hey, you got to go get some experience." Well, how do I do that? So I got some good advice, and there's like, you can either go this route, military, go into local law enforcement as you're studying, and going back to school. So I jumped in and I started at the local level here in Florida, in Palm Beach County, actually, and cut my teeth there. And that opened up an avenue, a conversation with one of my supervisors one night. And that door got opened and I stepped through it, and it was a journey. And 12 months later, I'm at a place that I never thought I would be and doing things that I never thought I would be doing as a youngest of 5, blue collar kid from South Florida. So it was pretty surreal, pretty adventurous.
That's wild, man. What year was that when you joined the police force?
So when I joined the local, when I became a deputy, I want to say it was going to be probably 1997.
Yeah.
Ish.
Those were the prime years for me, watching Cops on TV.
Well, kind of a funny side story to that is that Cops, the original version of it, was really filmed down in South Florida. It started in Broward County, which is just the county that I grew up in, and then Palm Beach County kind of became the next phase of it. But yeah, it was a South Florida. In law enforcement, I always have this funny thing, like when I read something in the newspaper and it seems really outlandish and wild, like where you see something come across, like now we have apps that show us news feeds, right? And if it's outlandish and wild, before I even read it, I say to myself, more than likely that happened in Florida. And when I click on it and I read it, and I'm like, yes, if it's in South Florida or Orlando or someplace, it's 9 times out of 10 is accurate. So I think if you're going to start a reality law
Yeah.
enforcement film, project probably was a good bet to start in South Florida.
Did you ever star on the show Cops? Did you ever
No,
make it?
it's actually funny though. I did not. They filmed a lot of times when I was working, and a lot of my really close sector mates, we called them, guys that would work adjoining sectors to me in shifts, are on it. So every once in a while, every blue moon, like you catch one of those syndicated ones, and
Yeah.
my wife absolutely hates them too, by the way. So like I can only really watch them when she's not in the room, and I'm like,
Yeah.
but like I'll catch like a 5 minutes of one, and I'll see an old friend of mine, back in the
That's
day,
amazing.
So
Like tackling somebody or getting beat
so
down or that also those were the years where I watched Dog the Bounty Hunter. Wasn't he in Florida too?
so I think Dog at one point in time in his long and illustrious career was in Florida. I think he spent most of it in Hawaii and some other
Okay.
place too. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
golly.
wherever the action is, those guys go. And unfortunately, and fortunately, depending on what side of the coin you're looking at, is that there's always a ton of action in law enforcement in
Yeah.
South Florida.
What were the years like for you in law enforcement? How was that? Like what was your expectation coming in and then like what was it when you're like actually in the force?
So it's interesting. I had an older brother who had just joined another city municipality police force in Palm Beach County, like probably about 2 years before I did. And so I got a little bit of understanding from him, watching him go through the process, and watching him kind of enter into that line of work. But we were working in such vastly different communities that I'm almost glad to be honest with you, Jay. It was like drinking from the fire hose. I mean, I grew up,
Yeah.
in a suburban context, kind of lower middle class, lower like kind of blue collar, type environment in South Florida. But we just thought everybody was in the same socioeconomic kind of, like that's what our neighborhood was, right? So we didn't know any better as kids. But this kind of opened my eyes to just a whole different reality when it comes to humanity
Yeah.
and just pain and suffering and loss and dysfunction, violence, addiction. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And I don't think anybody's ever really prepared for it, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, I started when I was 21 years old, and I mean, I grew up in a scrappy, multi-ethnic neighborhood in South Florida. So, like, I mean, we were the kids that jumped off the school bus and we had to fight our way to, home, and I mean,
Wow.
it was just one of those. There's always these little, the area neighborhood kids that, that this section didn't like this section didn't like that section. That's kind of the neighborhood that we grew up in. Super competitive. So, I'm the youngest of five brothers, so it wasn't taxing that way in terms of the physicalness of it.
Yeah.
It's, but I think the emotional kind of mental
Mhm.
side of it was a little bit overwhelming.
How did you deal with that? I mean, I have several friends who were police officers or are police officers, and I have one friend that is an ER doctor in a incredibly rough place.
Mm,
And I was talking to him last month, and he was just saying, man, like he's actually having to quit his job and move to something different. I think he's been there for 5 years as an ER doctor, and he said, man, I literally have these young teenagers coming in, 17 years old, and with gunshot wounds. And I like put them into our system and see that, oh, this is a third time in 6 months that we've patched up this kid's gunshot wounds.
mm.
They're just in so much violence, but he's dealing with a lot of trauma and pain and suffering. And like, how did you deal with that? What did that look like for you? Was it hard to work through? How did that manifest in your life?
I always like to say that I didn't know. I was a pretty resilient kid, and I didn't know how resilient I was. It was maybe a blessing and a curse. But my
Yeah.
20s, I often refer to as my dark decade. So
Wow.
I didn't do well in that. I went to self soothing mechanisms. I come from a long line of drinkers, and so that was kind of like my drug of choice. And I was uh, I was the functional guy though, like and it was
Yeah.
popular. It was popular um, in so many ways. And I get it now. At the time, it was very communal. Like, like you weren't going to go hang out with the guys from your shift on a day off, or even in the agency later, and you weren't going to travel unless there was some sort of drinking involved, and it involved in something of excess. So for me, it was, again, some of these patterns of behavior were, kind of teenage years on, but I look back on them now and go, man, this is such a self-soothing mechanism, just to be able
Yeah.
to escape, to be able to say, hey, I can turn it on and off, and kind of just check out for a little bit and numb kind of the reality of it. And then the other is, it's funny, years later, the Lord kind of opened up a reality to me. And I was just talking to my wife about it today. I was like, I'm a teary eyed guy now. I'm a more emotive man than I've ever been. Right. I just turned 50, and
Wow.
I make no apologies for it. Like when I preach a sermon, or if I'm touched by something in a conversation, it's like, and I just tell
Yeah.
people, I'm like, hey, if this is offensive to you, my apologies. But the Lord has redeemed some of those areas of tenderness, because in my 20s I just shut them off.
Yeah.
I found ways of like going, hey, I'm not going to feel anything anymore. So I did for 10, 12 years.
Wow. What was
I
that
don't remember
process
shedding a
like?
tear.
What was that process like? Starting to get some of that back. Do you remember?
Super wonky. I mean, like really, really, really weird. I mean, think about it. I'm 6'3". I come from this kind of, my brothers are 6'8", 6'5", 6'6". I mean, like it's just, we didn't have that type of,
Yeah.
family growing up. And then of course, profession, professions are interesting. You can kind of get um, there's there's a bit of a stereotype in every profession, and
Yeah.
certainly in
Your
law
identity. Yeah.
enforcement, it becomes who you are. And so at first it was kind of like, it was weird, to me. I always felt like I needed to apologize for it, but then the Lord just said, hey, no, this is my spirit working in you and through you and refining you, and also redeeming some of the years the locusts tried to destroy. And so I just, at some point in time, not shortly after that, I just kind of said, hey, this is who I am. This is what the Lord's made me to be. And, I tell my congregation when I'm preaching, I'm like, hey, and new people, welcome, to church. And, I could tear up at any minute. And if that makes you uncomfortable, there's a hallway, there's coffee outside, I love you. I'll give you a hug afterwards. This is who I am,
Man, I love it. Yeah. I mean, I guess if people are offended, they need to become more human, because it is so woven into our DNA. You don't know any babies that don't cry. You don't know any
Yeah.
toddlers that don't cry. And it's a learned behavior to shut down those emotions and to press them aside, and to pretend like somehow you're the one person on the planet that doesn't need that. And so, man, it really is. It's a long journey for a lot of us men to actually not just experience that, but to see the value in that, the redemptive value, the connection that comes through having emotion, the health that comes from being a whole human being. And it really is it's a long journey for a lot of men. And it's comforting to know that, for a lot of guys who are in the same type of situation as you, not necessarily, maybe were in the police force, maybe they're in the military, or maybe they're a construction worker. I mean, there's lots of different, I grew up in a town where it was all mill workers, loggers and mill workers. And those guys are as hard as anybody, you just get so tough. You get taught to not show your emotions. And so I work with a lot of guys, and I'm sure you do too, as a pastor, and, a guy that helps to lead men. And I mean, I work with a ton of guys who literally don't know how to access emotion anymore. Like it's been so far removed that now they're going through this journey of like, how do I awaken it? How do I step back into it? And so it gives a lot of guys hope just to know that it's possible. You can come out of where it's your identity. I'm a strong man. I'm a police officer. I don't show emotion. It's part of what saves me and protects me, is to, shut that stuff down, to watch a guy come through and be tender and gentle. Meek is probably the word. I like to use that word meek because it's actually the description of a Roman war horse, right?
Right.
This powerful but gentle being that knows how to use its power. So that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Um,
It's been a journey.
yeah, I bet. How did okay, so you were in the police force for a while and then you transitioned into the Secret Service. Like, how did people get into the Secret Service? Do you think I could like give them my resume and do I have a shot?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, the funny story behind mine is I'm writing a report one night in my patrol car, and my road sergeant, who was a very, very amazing human being, one of the kind of guys, a quintessential midnight road sergeant. He literally just gave me an application, and I'm thinking, there's no way this guy knows anybody at the Secret Service. He's never seen the light of day in probably 15 years. He's only worked midnights. I'm like, how does he network? How does he know anybody? And I just, he knew the right people. He gave me a paper application. This is how long ago it's been. And he just took a liking to me, and he said I wrote good reports. So I just come out of college, and so maybe I was on the brighter side IQ wise, you know, and he just saw something in me, and that started I literally filled out a paper application, believe it or not. Like I would like to think that and say that there was something
Yeah.
more like secretive or elusive about it, but
Yeah.
it was like a 16 or 18 page application, and I got dressed in a suit and went to the local field office here in South Florida, and I rang the bell and I handed it off, and that started a 14-month process of getting hired.
When before you filled out that form, did he come to you and say, "Man, I think that you have what it takes to jump into the Secret Service," or were you like, "Man, I'd really love to do something beyond this. I've been setting my sights on, something greater than this." Or how did you decide, like, I want to go into the Secret Service?
So it's interesting. He came to me. I remember specifically. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and he came rolling up to me, and I remember it. And maybe it wasn't this way, but he was eating chicken at night, like because
Yeah.
he's eating like a bucket of chicken at 2 o'clock in the morning. He's a road park.
Yeah.
If you want to meet really interesting people, hang
Yeah.
out with some midnight road sergeants. Guys who lead men and see the what's going on at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. These are amazing human beings, by the way. And but it's like his afternoon, right? It's like his lunchtime because that's when he's up and that's when he's working. That's when we're all working. And
That's
he
wild.
came up to me, and this is what he said to me. He's like, he called me by my last name. I remember. He's like, "Hey, Johnson, do you write pretty good reports or something to the effect like, hey, you're a pretty smart kid, right?" And by all stretch, I was a kid at the time. I was just early
Yeah.
20s. And I said, I appreciate it, Sarge. And he said, "Do you ever think about moving up?" That's what his comment was. I almost remember almost accurately. And I said, "Well, that's kind of the plan." Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, hey, I've got to go to law school yet. I got to check all these boxes. And then he starts fishing into his little side, filing cabinet in his front seat of his car. And back when we had file cabinets in our front seat of our car. Which you probably remember from watching an episode of Cops,
Yeah, dude, for
you know.
sure.
and he pulled out this application. And he said, "Here, fill it out. I know somebody. Just let me know, and I'll put a good word in for you." So, I always like to say that there was some sort of invitation process, something that he saw in me.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what it was, other than the
No,
fact
that's
that
cool.
maybe I wrote good reports.
So you filled that in, you brought it there, you hand your application in. What's like take us just quickly through that process of you said it was a 14-month process. Was that just like before you heard back or of them, looking at your past and all that stuff?
Yeah, that's a full deep dive. So it was stages in between that, probably 8 to 10 different stages, everything from the initial app, come on in, you have testing, that you have aptitude testing, both academic and physical. And then there's panel interviews, then there's polygraph and psych evaluations. And,
How'd you
if
do
you
on the
get,
polygraph?
it's, well, I obviously passed it. They're terrible. Anybody that's ever, I've taken a number of them over the
You
years.
have? Yeah, I've
They're
never
just,
taken one.
they're just, you know, they're awful. They really are because, they're just the mechanisms of them. You know, you see it on TV, and it looks pretty similar to obviously how it is on TV. And then the whole interview process is designed to be very adversarial, of course. They're not your friend, and you're not having coffee afterwards, and you
Yeah.
know, they like there's a little light swinging in the middle. No, it's I mean, it's meant to create stress. It's meant to create load and tension, and under load and tension, we expose things that aren't controlled by or we expose things that are being controlled by our subconscious, not our conscious mind. So,
Wow.
there's all these little
That's wild.
techniques, and yeah, it's so gone through all that. Then the final stage is you meet with the boss, and he hires you or chooses whether or not he's going to hire you from the local field office. And then you get selected to go into a training class, and that class is about 8 months long. So,
Is that like, is that everything from weapons training to, like the protocols and all that stuff?
everything from the law and the application of the laws to weapons to defensive driving to tactics to live fire scenarios to, you name it, and it's just drinking from the fire hose day in and day out.
Gosh, I couldn't even
Physical
imagine.
fitness, it's early mornings and late nights. Yeah.
Honestly, it sounds like a dream. It sounds like a young man's dream of jumping in the Secret Service, and all of a sudden you're like doing, what would you say, tactical driving and all this evasive driving or something, but all this crazy stuff. Was it like that, or was it just like a drag?
No, it really was. It was kind of like a crescendo of training. You obviously start out as just the basics, but in the middle of it, towards the middle end of it, you really start getting into just that we call it the high liability stuff is what it's called. Stuff that has high liability to it.
That's awesome.
Driving, shooting, putting your hands on people. And what entails that. In terms of meeting force with force or violence with violence. So yeah, it can get you know uh, pretty fast, pretty quick for sure. And then we had all kinds of people in our class too. I had a PhD professor. I had somebody from the Ranger Battalion. I had lawyers. I had other police officers. I had military intelligence guys in my class. I mean, you pretty much name
Yeah.
it, and it kind of had a cross section of humanity.
Wow, that's awesome. So when you graduated, then where do you jump into? Where'd you go?
So I went back to Miami, so where I was from, which I was fortunate enough. So I had spent a year away from my family. At the time, I had
Wow.
my son was being born, which I missed my son's birth. I was actually
No
in training.
way.
Yeah. So
Is your wife still mad?
she's forgiven me. He brings it up from time to time. He's 24. He's like, yeah, you missed my birthday. So that was pretty rough on us. The first couple of years of his, of course he's a young guy, but you're constantly missing birthdays and
Yeah.
Christmases and holidays. It's just the nature of the job and the activity. But I came back to Miami, and I wasn't in Miami long, and they asked me to be part of a specialty unit that was stationed out of Miami, and it was a unit that is designed around any type of water rescuing or safety that any of the protectees would ever be a part of. So as the agency has evolved since 1865, right, they realize that people do other things. They are protectees, presidents, vice presidents, former presidents. They, now they fish and boat and they recreate, they scuba dive, they do all these different things. And the mandate is protection 24/7, 365 days a year. So the agency had to adjust and accommodate a lot of these different things especially over the last 25, 30 years, as protectees have become more forward facing, more of the people. And so this unit was around for about 20 or so years, and it was in Miami. And so, growing up in South Florida, I was just, scuba diving and surfing and swimming. And I just grew up in the water at the beach. And so they were looking at my file, and they had a couple of openings, and I was already in Miami. So instead of bringing a guy from like Washington or New York,
Yeah.
they're like, hey, do you want to be part of this unit? And I'm like, oh, that sounds exciting. Yeah. but it required a whole bunch more training. I had to go back up to DC, but eventually after that training, I came back and I was kind of permanently stationed in Miami for the majority of my career because of that unit. So which kept me home, at least kept me in the same zip codes more. So I'm basically I'm TDY'd or temporary assigned to anybody and everybody. So if somebody comes to our district, which was basically from Orlando to the southern tip of South America, then I could get deployed anywhere, and we did a lot anywhere in that area. And then I'm on assignment to other parts of the world in support of that mission. So oftentimes, well, I mean, it would literally be a ton of travel, 200 plus days a year, oftentimes each year, and both in mostly in protective assignment travel. So when I say protective assignment travel, it's you're protecting our nation's leaders, former leaders, or other nations' leaders who come into our districts or come into the United States and have have been given protection by executive order of the President of the United States. So, I mean, I've had an interesting, protective assignment from the King of Jordan to prime ministers of Australia and Canada to European leaders to the president of Iran once.
Wow.
The president
What's
of
the
Djibouti.
craziest, what's the craziest one that you had that like, have you had stuff happen during your time?
Yeah, oh yeah. I'm not sure this podcast is long enough to tell them
Well,
all, but
bro, tell
um,
some of them. Tell your top favorites.
I think one of the more interesting ones, probably the more something I think that maybe your listeners would probably be more interested in. There's probably two that come to mind. Is one is I found myself in an elevator the same day with Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian basically
Yeah.
terrorist, the late Palestinian terrorist, with one of his goons and me and another agent. And then the same day, I was in an elevator with Ray Charles at the
What?
same hotel. So I'm thinking, what? You know, and both of them had completely unique and obviously very different reactions, right? One was hopefully not to start an international security incident, and the one was, and my wife always used to make fun of me because I've never really been starstruck. I'm not sure why. Maybe hanging around these guys and seeing the brevity of humanity, and honestly, to be totally honest with you, really kind of scratching my head, saying most of these people are insane, anyways.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes, like it's crazy to see and hear some of the things that I've seen and heard. But I don't know. I just never have been ultra like drawn to other people's fame or fortune. So, but I found myself with Ray Charles going, this guy's iconic. And I just remember looking at him going, and he wasn't one of our protective assignments. He was just happened to be in the hotel, evidently, and
Yeah.
maybe visiting somebody that was. And I was like, hey, Mr. Charles. And it was exactly how you would remember it on a Pepsi commercials. He's like, hey, he was just had this really smooth baritone voice. And it was just me and his handler and him. And I'm like, immediately I called my wife and I'm like, you're never going to believe this. She's thinking, did I meet like Vladimir Putin or,
Yeah.
like, did I like somebody like the Queen or maybe the Pope? I'm like, no, it was Ray Charles, man. Like, like the
That's
iconic.
awesome.
So that was an interesting time. But I've had so many interesting experiences. Fly fishing with Dick Cheney. I wasn't fly fishing, obviously, but he was. He
That's
consummate
cool.
outdoorsman all throughout the American West and um, Colorado, Wyoming, and some of the iconic things that we did in support of
Yeah.
his missions and just some of his recreation that he would do as an outdoorsman. I know you and I have talked about our love for the outdoors. So a lot of that, came was insulated and kind of affirmed in my time hanging out with Dick Cheney.
Did you ever get into a moment where you're like, I don't know, I'm going to make it through this?
Several, yeah, um, yeah, several. And as my mind has eased over the years, I can remember some that I had forgotten.
Oh, no
So
way.
yeah. So it's like, how you get to that, your brain starts to heal and you're like, wow, that really was a bad situation that I was
Yeah.
in, you know. I think one that comes to mind was when I was in a local when I was a local deputy. It was I never look at Thanksgiving the same because it was a particularly violent situation on Thanksgiving right when I was like my first or second year that I was in, and violent shootout, multiple officers, and just multiple locations, and involved vehicles, and ultimately the suspect succumbed to his injuries in that. But just as a young 22-year-old man, and seeing that kind of take place live and in person, the sounds, the
Yeah.
smells, the feelings of that as an impressionable young man just stay with you forever. You just can't
Yeah.
unsee things. And then as an agent, there's a time in overseas where I probably thought it was like this was the end, as closest to the end as possible. And that's probably why I never want to go back to Puerto Rico again. I know it's a true statement. I had a business contact of mine, a business friend of mine several years ago, who happens to live in Puerto Rico for some tax advantages, I guess, for
Yeah.
him. Um, and he's like, you need to come down, you and your wife, you guys need to come down and spend a week with us. And I'm like, there's no way I'm ever coming back to that island. Of course
Seriously.
he had no context of it. Yeah. We were down there serving multiple warrants all at once from Miami. And I think it was 40 warrants at
Oh my gosh.
once simultaneously that had to go off at midnight. And I just found myself in a really bad situation in some urban slum, and with very corrupt local police officers, and everybody had pistols pointed at each other, and shoulder fired weapons at each other. And I quickly realized that I'm the only guy that doesn't speak Spanish here,
Oh my gosh.
and and chickens are running around squawking, and people are hollering, and it felt like something out of Training Day a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah.
and honestly, I was like, oh man, there's just going to be a muzzle flash. I'm going to see a muzzle flash, and it's all going to be over. This is where it goes down right here. In some dirt hole of a street in
Yeah.
outside of San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Serving a warrant. Yeah.
Of all the places, of all the things that I've done that could have taken my life, this is it. So those are just a handful of
Yeah.
times. But man, there's been several of even things in just training, like some training that we did that you're thinking this could go either way. Driving, high speed chases, and I like to say that I have a sensitivity to men and women that do this job. There's an endorphin and an adrenaline rush that happens, but
Yeah.
your adrenal glands take a pounding for it the older you get, and it does make you numb for a while. So you see a brashness, you see a coarseness in them, and it's by design. They just to be able to survive, to see the things that they see, and
Yeah.
to function at a level of humanity. Yeah, there is a bit of
Yeah.
that has to happen almost.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's wild. It really is wild. So we're not going to talk politics a lot. I don't actually hardly ever talk politics on the BraveCo podcast. But we had, a really unique year this year where
Yeah,
obviously we're in the middle of we just finished a big political push, the election just happened. And so, crazy year with Donald Trump getting, shot once and shot at twice, and then another attempt thwarted, I think is what was confirmed. When you saw Donald Trump get shot in the ear, like, what was your first reaction to all of that? And then I want to ask you about some of the details about it, but what was your first reaction? Because it's been so long since we've had an assassination attempt, and different sides always throw out, things, and you kind of don't really think much about it, but what was your first reaction to it?
well, it's interesting. My first reaction, I think I had just met you. We just had lunch because I
Yeah.
was out in California when I was actually just getting into my hotel room, and somebody from my church was calling me like crazy, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I obviously turned the TV on and I realized what was going on. So my first reaction, probably a little bit different than most of the Americans that saw it. Obviously you got concerned, like, like, is everybody okay? Did he
Yeah.
take a round to the head? You really couldn't see, or to the chest. Is there anything significant? I'm just getting this, not watching the TV. I'm just getting it, via text message. And then immediately when I saw it, I thought, well, somebody's going to get fired. I mean, that was kind of my
Yes.
initial, like. So there was a saying on the, and that was just my own internal head thinking that way. Like, there's going to be somebody's going to
Yeah.
be held account to this, right? There's going to be some sort of issue fallout here. There was a saying on the job that we had that, you never wanted the CNN or Fox News factor. So like you never wanted to screw up bad enough to
Yeah.
where like you were on Fox News or CNN. And of course, over the last couple of years, you've seen screw ups from this agency where they've ended up on CNN or Fox News. Now, this would probably be the most iconic and most
Yeah.
certainly talked about one, but there's been others in recent history too as well. And it was always just a no. So here I am looking at this in the lobby of a hotel in your hometown because I was just checking in, right? And
Yep.
and I was like, oh man, this is going to be bad. Once I realized he was okay, I thought, man, this is not going to go well for a number of folks.
Man, it's such, yeah. I mean, okay, so now on the back end, like we have a whole bunch of more information than of course we had in the very beginning. Like it's really crazy to watch everything that happened and went down. And like, what's your assessment of the whole thing? Everything from, we know that guy, I can't remember his name, but flew a drone over that area for a long time. Also, like basically, I think he brought a ladder, to climb up onto the building. The shot was only 150 yards away. And, several people saw him with a gun before. We saw the police officer, and I'm not here to like point fingers and go, oh my gosh,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
horrible police
No, I get.
officers, but just like the facts. Like we saw a police officer climb up on the shoulders of another guy, I think, and jump down when that guy pointed his gun. Like looking back, like what's your assessment on that whole thing? What happened yeah, what was the breakdown? And I don't know, what are your thoughts about it all?
Well, there's always been a term. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback,
Yeah.
and certainly this one's a little bit easier to Monday morning quarterback because we've got so many angles and so many pieces of camera footage and whatnot. But I mean, I think systemically the breakdown is money
Wow.
and oversight. So what most people don't know is, a former president of the United States has a much smaller detail and budget than the sitting president of the United States.
Yeah.
And that's the way it's been for decades, by the way. So like when I would go to assignment on a former president, and I protected, everybody from the Bushes to the Clintons to even Gerald Ford when he was alive, and Lady Bird
Wow.
Johnson before she passed. I mean, these were just former individuals, so their details would be um, consistent with their travel and their security threat analysis, if that makes sense. And
Yep.
so I think if there was any Monday morning quarterbacking for me, was that somebody missed the boat, whether that be intentional or whether that be just malicious and intentional, or whether it just be incompetent.
Yeah.
Because you can have a mixture of both, by the way. And
Yeah,
believe
you
me,
can.
I've spent enough time in government work that most of the time it is a little mixture of both. Is
Wow.
is is they just didn't provide the assets necessary, and then they didn't utilize those assets necessary with the right leadership on the ground, and those things ultimately came back to um, to 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 hurt them in a real physical way. Obviously, the former president or the
Yeah.
president elect now, but also their careers and whatnot, and obviously got somebody killed in the process of that by failing to protect that. Now, the silver lining in it, is that the elements that were supposed to happen did happen. So,
Mm.
like for instance, our counter sniper guys are some of the best in the world. They train, and to get on that team is some of the hardest. At least
Yeah.
in what I remember, the
Yep.
requirements when I was there were some of the most exhaustive to get on that team, and those guys were able to turn and neutralize the threat, almost immediately. But it was kind of too late at that point in time. So we always played the idea is the best defense is the greatest offense. So if shots rang out at a Secret Service site that we were in charge of, usually some form of the site had broken down, dramatically.
Yeah.
That's why you don't hear about it a lot.
Oh
Is
yeah.
because they take an extensive amount of time to plan the security element outward. And I will tell you that having been on campaign trails, it's exhausting too, by the way.
Oh my
The
gosh, I
assets,
could
the
imagine.
assets are stretched so thin. And now you have this political climate where, you withhold dollars potentially just because you don't like this person or that person. Wasn't much of an issue when I was on. Like, the Clintons to the Bush, even though they were Democrat to Republican, there was a fairly consistent level of respect and honor between the two, and level of civility between the two that made it
Yeah.
easy in transitions like that. But now you start to see a breakdown a little bit of that. So I always like to say that maybe more incompetence, than maliciousness. I would say maybe there's a little bit of that in there, but certainly incompetence was high, to allow that to happen.
I mean, what a wild turn of events. I guess there's probably a ton of threats. I think about this a lot. There's probably a lot of threats that get stopped that you never actually hear about as well. I mean, is that like on a detail like that? I could just imagine how many things you guys catch that you never gets reported to the news and things. Is that true?
One of the most interesting cases, criminal cases that I ever worked here in South Florida was a threat against the president case.
Wow.
It took me and an FBI agent months to break the case, and it got so high up that we were detailing it to the directors of both agencies, day in and day out. We had daily briefings. It was
Wow.
so visceral, the threat, and we just we didn't know where it was coming from. And we ended up arresting a mental patient from it in South Florida, and
Wow.
exhausting work. But no one will ever hear about that. To my knowledge, he's still in federal prison, but it
Wow.
was to the extent that some of these threats will go. So they're a real element of what these guys do, both the Secret Service and the FBI. And that's why they have to track down even the most
Yeah.
seemingly, insignificant threat, usually you'll get some sort of response, especially nowadays.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as my criminal cases go, that will probably be certainly one of the top two or three that I worked for sure.
You don't really think about it, being on the outside looking in, but the wear and tear, the amount of just on the road, constantly thinking about threats, constantly, especially in the political, like when you do a long stretch, like, campaigning and things like that. I mean, the amount of tension that everybody's under and
Mm.
on both sides, but the guys who are trying to account for everything, is every angle thought about, is every detail covered. And I just can imagine the emotional wear and tear that it takes on everybody to make sure that people are safe and cared for. And, it's a lot, man. That had to be a lot.
But it certainly is a high responsibility. And I think the agency, to give them kudos, and I have a lot of friends that are still there. A lot of them have since retired, but
Yeah.
it's the smallest of all the federal agencies. I think there's only like 3,500 of us worldwide. And
Wow.
so as the elements of protection continue to increase, the demands, I think Congress is going to have to look at, the budgets, and try to get the amount of right personnel on in order to accomplish the task, because it's getting ever so complex in the years since I was even there. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is heavy, the amount of travel and the amount of time. Not so much the physical aspect of it,
Yeah.
the danger aspect of it, because if you do your job, pretty much mitigate a lot of the danger away. You have time, unlike being a local police
Yep.
officer or deputy, you show up when it's meltdown mode. Like you don't have any time to kind of secure the area, cordon off things, to make things pleasant. You come
Yeah,
in
it's
when it's
true.
a 5 alarm fire. And we had the luxury of at least, sometimes weeks on end planning and executing well. So, it does make it harder on campaign trails, like campaign years. These guys are going, they're hitting 5 or 6 different cities in a day, and everyone has to have a consistent element of security to it. And this one, unfortunately, in Pennsylvania was just a massive breakdown in many levels. So, but yeah, it's
That's wild.
taxing on in terms of a humanity level for sure.
That's wild, man. Well, we don't have much time left, but I wanted to, you worked in the Secret Service for a while and then transitioned out of there. What caused you to transition out into ministry? Like what was pulling you in that direction?
Honestly, it was I realized that if I didn't, my home life and my marriage would probably have ceased to exist. And it was something just
Wow.
internal in me that the Lord just said, "Hey, this is something that you wanted to do, and I gave you some space in it, but like, I need you not to do it. I need you to do something else right now." And I didn't know what that was, to be honest with you, Chad. I didn't know. Like God didn't say, "Hey, I want you to come out and go full-time ministry." I probably would have said, "No way." I know I would have said no way to that,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
So it was a season of wooing after I came out of the service, and I had a lot of work to do with my family. Like a lot of men that I meet, they're just unaware. They don't mean to be. Some of them do, but most of them,
Yeah.
most of the men that I meet are just they're just unaware of the carnage that their past, their pain, their environment is creating on their spouse and their family. And I think most of the time, 95% of the time, once they're made aware, and usually that's by the Spirit of God or and trusted friends around them, a good community, and they're so willing to jump in with the Lord and fix it.
Yeah.
I mean, very few people that just want to see the barn burn. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Once they know, I think
Yeah,
they
it's
just
true.
walk into ignorance. So that was kind of my story. Is once I realized, like, hey, this is my barn's on fire. Like it's on fire bad. And once I realized, and I always prided myself on a pretty self-aware, emotionally intelligent individual. And I look around, I'm like, man, no one's telling me that my house is on fire. Like, what's going on? The reality is because everybody around me's house is on fire.
Yeah, man, that's a really good point. I mean, it's easy to walk into somebody else's house and be like, "Oh, they're doing great," when yours is like completely melting down. But there's also that element of no one really sees what's going on internally. Only we
Mm-hmm.
do. And it's very hard to see what's going on internally inside of a marriage as well, and inside of a family unit. But man, taking a step back, and it's also part of why I got out of firefighting. I fought fire for a couple of years and then realized like, this is not working for my wife. Being gone, anytime there's an emergency, you're going to get a call and you're going to have to go. And when are you going to be back? When I get back, I don't know. And that just, there's a very small number of people that can live like that, marriages that can live like that, families that can live like that and actually thrive. The rest, it just takes such a toll. And you're right. Like having to know when to take a step back and reevaluate and get well and get healthy that's a big process.
And it's been a journey, and the Lord's been gracious to me. And when I came back, my wife and I had two more children, biologically, and then we adopted our fifth a number of years back. And so we
Amazing.
watched our family grow, and my my daughters and my son are just growing into the people of God that He's called them to be. And my wife and I are super excited about that.
Man, it's so cool. I loved meeting you the first time and just I was so thankful that Tim connected us and just meeting guys that I don't know are super honest and going after life and doing really hard things and following the Lord. I mean, this is what following the Lord looks like. And I love to bring different guys in here so that, it's not what it looks like to follow Christ looks like a lot of things. It looks like you could take a mission and be in the middle of Iraq. It looks like you could, be a farmer but everybody goes through their different struggles and their different battles. And it's just so cool to see you have, served in the police force and served our United States, government, and now you're a pastor and leading these ministries, and it's just awesome, man. Thank you so much for your service, for your dedication to us, for putting your life out there, and then also, showing and leading men and families, and showing what it looks like to be a man of God, owning your stuff, walking through the hard things, and coming out the other side. Dave, you're such a beast, man. I really look up to you, and thank you for coming on the podcast, man.
Well, Jay, it's my pleasure, and thanks for the invitation. And I love what you're doing, and it was a joy to get to meet you, spend some time, and I look forward to getting some more opportunity with you. Fishing those rivers, or putting some lead down range, whatever we're going to do, and just getting to know each other more. And I love what you guys are doing at BraveCo. So anything I can do to help, please, you know how to get a hold of me.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it so much. BraveCo men, I hope you enjoyed this week. Have an incredible week. Stay brave out there. Hey, BraveCo men, hopefully you loved this week's episode. Listen, if you have not subscribed to our podcast, you are already behind. Go ahead and click right here to subscribe to our podcast. And if you have not watched last week's episode, you can click right here and watch last week's episode. And listen, if you want to upgrade your wardrobe, you can check out some of our new hats that we have in stock and all our other swag. Go to braveco.org and you can look at our store there. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.